even, recording in progress, endorsements of candidates, or, that side of the work is, how much of that changes when you start to talk about that side of the coin?
Sure, that's a really good point. And I should say that grant funds should say, or grant agreements should say that grant dollars cannot be used for partisan political purposes. I mean, the foundation can't spend money on it. And frankly, if you're making grants to a public charity, they should not be doing it either. And so, again, we often encourage grants to say, you can't use the money for partisan political purposes as well. There's another piece, and we didn't get into, and we can come back if you want to talk more about election activity. But there's a weird quirk in the law that makes it more difficult for private foundations to fund voter registration drives. And just like there's language in the law that says private foundations are subject to an excise tax if they spend money on lobbying, there's also language that says private foundations are subject to an excise tax if they earmark money for voter registration drives. And so these same principles apply when thinking about voter registration drives. If you were to make a general support grant to an organization that does some voter registration, but they do a lot of other things as well, they can choose to use some of the money for voter registration drives. They can choose to use some of the money to buy new computers. It's up to them. But again, you would not want to make a grant as a private foundation that says, here is $15,000 to do a voter registration drive in Kansas. There's a safe harbor that if grantees meet certain criteria, private foundations can fund them. But again, these rules sort of apply, these general rules that we've been talking about in terms of not earmarking grants for lobbying apply to private foundations for lobbying and funding voter registration drives. But again, grants should say that the funds can't be used for partisan political activity. And that's sort of that should not be as a shock to the grantee, but should be a reminder to them that, oh yeah, we can't, hopefully they know that. And if they don't, that's a really important conversation to have, and good heads up for them, but for them to know, that they can't do that.
I have a question, and this may not be the most, anyhow, it may be a bit of a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So you grant to a C3, that C3 also has a C4,
yep.
Right? Obviously, those are two different organizations, although they're highly connected to each other. That C3 takes it upon themselves to kind of give over money over to their C4, obviously from the grant.
Yep.
Obviously that's not, they shouldn't do that, right? Because that's going against kind of the agreement that the grant has made, which is to their entity only. My question is obviously that's a knock on them. Is that at all a knock on the foundation that provided the grant?
No, but I will also say it depends how it's not necessarily impermissible for the grantee to do that. It depends how the grant is made. So if a private foundation makes a general support grant to Alliance for Justice, so it's up to us to decide how to spend the money. If we choose to spend some of that money by essentially hiring or partnering with our affiliated C4 to accomplish some of the work, and we make a grant to the C4 to do some of the work, that's perfectly legal to do that. If the grant said, this money is to be used by Alliance for Justice and can't be, and the work can't be done by anyone else, then again, that grant language sort of trumps. But it all depends on sort of how the grant is structured, and it depends on sort of what the work is. I think where we often, and there are ways that, and we actually are getting ready to release a new guide in the next, hopefully, week or two, that talks to that's sort of for C3s, how they can sort of at the end of the year, if they find that, under that formula that we talked about a while ago, and that maybe we said they could spend up to, 20%, so maybe they could spend up to, $100,000 on lobbying this year. If they get to the end of the year and they're like, ooh, we only spent 30,000 on lobbying, they could legally make a grant to the C4 that basically spends their lobbying cap, gets the money to the C4. The C4 can use it in future years for lobbying, and then it counts against the C3's current year lobbying limit. That's perfectly legal. It's up to the grantee to then figure out, though, how it reports back to the funder, how it spent the money. So some of this will be the relationship, and some of this is what the law legally says. Some of this is about your relationship with funders, and this is where we always, sort of caution groups that just because you can do something doesn't always mean you should. But you need, the C3, if all it does is take money in and grants it to the C4, and then the C4 does all the work. When at the end of the grant period, when the C3 has to write a report and says, this is what we did, if they need to be able to show something for it, not just we granted all of our money to our affiliated C4. So it's a dance. And so, getting back to Miles, to your question, there are ways that grantees can do that, but a lot of it has to do with what was the grant for, how was the grant made, and so what are those kinds of expectations?
Can I have just a quick anecdote, Abby, that I think is illuminating?
Yeah.
One of the things we did at healthcare, because sometimes some of this stuff, it can feel icky. It can feel like there's shell games and money moving around, and it doesn't have to be that way. So we did some work at the Healthcare Foundation, Health Forward Foundation, around a ballot initiative. And we originally gave some money to the American Cancer Society to consider pursuing a ballot initiative around the tobacco tax. And they did use their grant money to do a lot of the groundwork, and decided that it was something that was going to move forward. And they created a C4 to help run this statewide ballot initiative. And they actually then wanted to take some of the money that was sitting at the Cancer Society and put it in the C4, because they now had the actual tax vehicle that they were going to need to run this ballot initiative. And we allowed them to do that. I mean, we hadn't put any strings on the original grant agreement. Transparency was a big value at Health Forward, is a big value at Health Forward. So we actually did let our board of directors know, and I think we might have even done an amended grant announcement clarifying that some of the funds would be passed on to this C4. But that's a time where you're not saying hey, C3, we're going to give you money, and then next we want you to turn around and give it to the C4 or anything nefarious. It's just the work can sometimes evolve in a way where going from a C3 to a C4 makes sense. Little ad. Sorry. Go ahead, Abby. Or other questions?
No, this is everybody jump in. And so, there's a big difference if the public charity is, making a grant specifically to a C4. And this is what if a grantee is making a grant specifically to a C4, and there are ways, and we can talk about how to do that in just a minute. But this is the one time where the grant needs to say, you cannot spend our money for lobbying. And so Haley.
I'm curious if Tim could weigh in on when you were talking about the grant agreement language and some of the reporting that's done. I'm wondering what our foundation, Tim, what Kauffman Foundation's thinking is, because we do include the lobbying language in our grant agreement. Can't be used for lobbying, I believe, in all of our grants. And then I know we've done the advocacy compliance reporting on the back end, where we do ask them to share with us, in some cases, to organizations that do lobbying activities, how they spent the funds, and if they did lobby, where those lobbying funds came from.
Yeah, Hallie, I would say two things. One, it's a pretty conservative approach, honestly, to do that. I think what we try to do is just get out of the business of having the grantee have to report to us what percentage of their project is going to be spent on lobbying, and then having to implement the project grant rules. So it can be a complicated thing to do. And so I think that's just it's a sledgehammer approach. Honestly, we just say you can't lobby. So I think Abby makes some really good points here for consideration, but that's why we do that generally, because it can be a complex thing. If we give the $60,000 and the grantee says, hey, we're going to do $60,000 of non-lobbying, but then they go and they spend $70,000 on lobbying, we perhaps have an issue. So those kinds of oddities are why we do that. But I think, as Abby says, it's a pretty conservative approach and perhaps isn't always necessary. I was going to add one other thing, Abby, because I think you said early on about the earmarking. So to Miles' scenario, I think what's really important there is the C3 is making the decision, hey, we're going to give this money to the C4 and we're going to pass this along. And that the foundation is not saying, hey, I see you have a C4, maybe you could pass your money along to them and they could lobby. It's really important that we as the foundation are not engaged in that decision making, that we're not earmarking funds for lobbying or to go to that C4.
Exactly. And so it's really all about that control. So one of the questions that came at the very beginning was sort of about trends. And we are seeing where foundations are making more grants to C4s or asking about it. And you can see on the screen my very good PowerPoint skills. So I apologize for and this is, again, an area where there's a big difference between how a public charity like the Community Foundation can fund versus what a private foundation can do. And why working in, with funder collaboratives and having different funders part of efforts, that different funders can play different pieces. So public charities, again, can fund other public charities. And if they earmark a grant, it'll count against their lobbying limit. But a public charity can make a grant to another public charity and say, you can use this money for lobbying. If a public charity can also make a grant to a C4 organization. And these are the same rules that apply whether it's Alliance for Justice is making a grant to our affiliated C4 or whether a community foundation is making a grant to the Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. Here, the presumption will be that any grant that's made from a public charity to a C4, the presumption is that the funds will be spent on lobbying. So if a public charity makes a grant to a C4 and says, here's $15,000, unless there's language in the grant that says anything else, the presumption will be that all $15,000 will count against the public charity's grassroots lobbying limit. And the public charity will have to track it against its lobbying limit. If the public charity doesn't want those funds counted that way, they can put more limitations, more control in the grant and say, we're giving you $15,000. You can use up to $10,000 on direct lobbying. You can use $5,000 for grassroots lobbying, or sometimes, we don't want you to use any of the money for lobbying. They can put limitations in, but the presumption will be when a public charity makes a grant to a C4 that the funds will be spent on lobbying. Private foundations, on the other hand, again, can fund C4 organizations, but in order to do so, the IRS requires that foundations use what's called expenditure responsibility rules, which is essentially an enhanced due diligence process. And in many cases, it's the same kind of due diligence that most foundations do on a regular basis. But under these expenditure responsibility grants, the grant agreement needs to say these grant funds cannot be used for lobbying. And the grantee needs to provide regular reports back to the foundation. And the foundation actually needs to report separately on its 990 PF about any expenditure responsibility grants that it makes. So private foundations could make these types of grants to fund some of the educational work that the C4 does. And this gets back to, again, one of the questions we were talking about at the beginning about, sort of the best use of C4 dollars. And, this is where, sometimes a C4 will, may be lobbying, a C4 may do some partisan political stuff, but they also may be doing research on, is recess good or bad? And the private foundation could fund that research, even though they couldn't fund all of the other work of the foundation. So these types of expenditure responsibility grants have the most control over how the funds can be spent, but they do allow foundations to fund non-public charity entities. And again, I would say up to 3 years ago, if you had asked, are there foundations that sort of make these kinds of grants? There were very few. We're starting to hear more and more from foundations thinking about what that could mean. So what other questions? I know we are getting to, I wanted to save some time at the end for general questions. And I realize there's a lot more we could talk about. We didn't really get into elections, but wanted to really just pause now and see sort of what, if there are other questions, thoughts, ideas, more information that you'd like. Does everybody want a nap after lunch?
Well, Abby, I might ask, to Hallie's question about, do we need to put that grant language in there? I think one of the things that we are concerned about often is whether the grantee understands these rules.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't, are they putting us at risk? Are there hallmarks or signs that you would look for in a grantee that says, hey, these people clearly understand these rules, what they're doing, and everything is safe for you?
I mean, I think, I'm just making a note. I think one of the areas is talking to grantees about the 501H expenditure test. And I usually have more comfort if a grantee has made the 501H expenditure test. One, again, the definitions of what's lobbying are easier. They are ways it's easier for them to track it. And so, that often, and it's a sign that they even know that these rules exist. And so, asking about the 501H expenditure test is often a hallmark. There's some found, that's, probably the place that I start. And different foundations approach this in different ways of providing different information. I know some foundations, provide links to various resources and other information, provide training for grantees. But I think, otherwise, if you ask a grantee, okay, do you understand the difference between advocacy and lobbying? Most people are like, yeah. But you don't really, until you start getting into the specific question, you give them a quiz, you don't really know whether they know, they know or not. I think some of it's looking at the, I think sometimes, and part of this is that the language is so imprecise. And, I think sometimes groups think, oh, well, we shouldn't mention lobbying. So we'll just, if we don't say the word, that's okay. Other times, grantees talk so big picture that you're actually not sure what they're doing at all. So I think some of it really, so no, I don't, as I'm now realizing I'm not answering your question at all, but it's hard because there's no one size fits all. And, unless you sort of provide a quiz to the groups and say, okay, what is your understanding? But I think asking, have you ever gone through some training? Have you made the 501H expenditure test? Looking at, do you have a system of how you track lobbying? And again, it could be done, it could be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be a Word document on a clipboard, on somebody's desk. It doesn't need to be fancy, but if they're like, well, we don't know that we need to have it, that could be a sign. And so I think some of those basic pieces could be important.
Abby, if I can just to jump in and think about another side of Tim's questions is, as we think about our space and wanting, I think so many groups that are participating in advocacy and lobbying are, at that grassroots level, and it doesn't look like, it is that Excel clipboard. It is, there's nothing sexy about it. And so I certainly want us to think about, ways in which we can build their capacity and their understanding of what are good questions and good practices, but not create additional barriers to being able to engage directly with organizations that are doing that work as well. Because I think that that has been the challenge, is because we sit in these, in these seats, in these positions, that we want to protect ultimately the organization, the brand, those types of things, but we inadvertently create additional barriers to actually moving the needle on issues that need to be moved on. So I offer that up as a, there's no, I don't know that there's a checklist. If there is, I'm like, Abby, send it, because you've dropped so much knowledge in this already that I'm like, whatever you say, I'll do. But also, that not letting the messy and the vague and the gray be the deterrent for engaging.
I mean, I guess one other, sort of two things to that. One is, the advocacy capacity tool that I mentioned, could also be something that, and we have a very long version, but then there's also a short version, that can take 10, 15 minutes, that could get, ask some of the questions. But I think some of it too is, and I know as I've been having conversations with foundation general counsels over the last year or so, there is some concern as the field is growing and we're seeing a lot of new organizations get involved in advocacy, people coming in who are, really strong activists, but don't necessarily come from the nonprofit world. And these rules are not intuitive. These rules don't make sense. No one, knows, thinks about them except for me and my team, and so, how do we, and again, it's that, how do we educate people about it without scaring them so they don't do it? But we also don't want lack of compliance to be what brings them down. And we don't want to jeopardize the really important work that they're doing by not understanding. We used to have this long-standing sort of conversation with our, with our former president, our former outside counsel, of like, you want to be able to say, oh, this is so easy, it's so accessible, everybody jump on in, but the general counsel will be like, no, but people need to know what they're getting into to do this. And it's sort of, how do you, where do you find that line? But I think it's also with foundations being willing to talk about advocacy. And I think being willing to say, and to say to grantees, we want you to be doing advocacy. We're okay even if you lobby, but we want to make sure you understand what the rules are. And if you don't know, let us know and we can help connect you. And again, it's whether you provide money in certain grant agreements, or certain grants, and that say you have to hire counsel or you have to get training, or but not, I think so often grantees are afraid to even mention advocacy, or they don't want to say that they don't know something. And so the more you can even have those conversations and say, we know this is messy. We know there's a lot you can do. We also know that, we may be conservative and risk averse, and we want to protect us and all of the work we're doing and the ability to support this work. But we want to make sure, and so we want to make sure that you understand how to do this. And so there's no one right way to do that, but having those conversations and not assuming that, everybody's coming to this with this information, but also, and, and figuring out how to say, to make sure people understand it without scaring them. And connecting with other resources, because there are lots of other resources that, can help groups. Sorry, I was just cutting somebody off.
No, you're fine. I'm very interested in that topic, because when I think a lot about activism, right? Social justice movements, what have you, they're often very poorly resourced. And yet they have the potential to make seismic change and actually move along agendas sometimes more rapidly, because they have a real connection to I think, lots of people potentially if they're well organized and they're executing well.
Yeah.
And we've seen just in the last year some really great things that have happened on a legislative level and across the board, and it's also just on a social and narrative kind of change level when activists have been involved. So, okay, my question is, recognizing that can be messy, right? Activists oftentimes are not maybe as disciplined as a nonprofit or an organization. Has there been any kind of models that you've seen with kind of an intermediary that foundations may fund the intermediary, and that intermediary then supports activists that are on the ground, but can help with managing some of those kind of regulations and rules?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we've seen that with, with foundations who are funding, who definitely do that. I mean, we see that there are oftentimes where, and again, it's through fiscal sponsors, and some fiscal sponsors exercise a lot more control and sort of have staff that can provide that back end support and some of that compliance support to help groups do that. But we've seen more, we do see some of that regranting of finding, a national organization maybe, or a regional organization that has staff, has capacity to provide more expertise, more technical assistance to groups on the ground, and to do it that way rather than the foundation providing grants directly. Sometimes it's also that, with all, some of the new grassroots groups, that foundations don't necessarily know who all the players are. And so rather than the foundation, figuring out from their, sort of up peer level, funding an intermediary who's closer to the ground, who can figure out who the best players are to carry out the work. And so there, I think we're seeing a lot of those kinds of models. And there's been, I think over the last 2 years, 3, few years, I think since, well, maybe 5 now, with sort of the Trump administration, sort of a lot more of this trying to think about how to do things differently. And as more activists have gotten into the space of trying, and people often get frustrated. We talk to people all the time who are like, these rules don't make sense. I don't like these categories of the tax law. And it's like, yeah, the law wasn't necessarily built for this and wasn't created with, some of the structures and the way people want to do their work today. And it's messy, and there's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. But some of it's also just sort of, figuring it out, playing with it. And Jess just put in the chat room that Borealis Philanthropy is a great model of sort of supporting grassroots organizations.
Hey, Abby, the other thing I would say, that this is the point that actually supports both Samara and Miles' point, like they're an organization that needs fewer barriers, doesn't have capacity or perhaps even discipline, is just to make a general support grant. And honestly, that's not a legal issue. That is a program team saying, hey, here's $50,000, do with it as you please. And they can go lobby, they can go do whatever the heck they want, but that requires us to say, we will trust you with this money to do what's right with it.
Yeah.
What we end up doing is saying, oh, here's some money, but here's what you have to do with it, and show us all the things you're doing with it. If we just give up the control and say, hey, here's the money, go do with it, we don't have to worry about any of these issues.
Absolutely.
Hallelujah, Tim. Hallelujah.
I mean, and that's where it often seems really weird that it's sort of the more control the foundation gives up, the more legal protection it has.
Yeah, and I think too, I would add to that on the kind of, from the 2 avenues standpoint, the educate versus the, use your percentage or whatever. From that standpoint, I think we have to be really careful with that educate. We're all here because we're interested in supporting the early education sector. And, what do we know about the early education sector right now? It's that, organizations can't even keep staff in classrooms, let alone, invest dollars into, into lobbying and, advocacy at this point. So I think as we kind of build strategies on how we want to do this work, either within our own organizations or together as a group, I think it's going to be really important for us to take a look at the power dynamic that we have between us and these organizations, because I think you know, from my standpoint, you know, I approach this work with the first rule of being do no harm. And I think the last thing that any of us would want is to go try to educate an organization about how they can do lobbying and then feel like they have to start to do this work so that they can retain the relationship with us. And so I think, you know, all of this information is super helpful, but I think we all probably need to be really cognizant of, you know, the space that we're working in, the power that we have, and, you know, and where it's appropriate to have these conversations and where it may not be.
Absolutely. And again, we have lots more resources on our website. These are just a few of the pieces we have for foundations. But I will, you know, we'll send you all of these slides. We'll provide links to some of our key resources, but also my contact information. And, you know, feel free to reach out with specific questions. I've actually been talking with, and there was some materials too. I've been talking with some of the folks in the entrepreneurship program at Kauffman. And so, you know, really excited to keep talking, and we are here sort of in the long term to, as you sort of think more about advocacy.
I have it's more of a question. It's a question maybe Abby can answer, but it's also a question to my fellow attendees. How much of when we think about our roles in this is also about educating our boards, you know, trustees as well? I just know personally how sometimes they think they know and how very little they actually know and understand. And that is me saying this as someone who knows half a step more, maybe than they do. And so that becomes the barrier, is the lack of understanding at that level. So it's like, wait, you want to do what? Well, we can't do that. It's going to happen here. And so I just wonder if anyone else has engaged, or is that something we also want to think about collectively, how we educate and engage our boards, our trustees, our decision-making entities, committees, whatever, around this, such that, we're able to move things quicker, more intentionally as well.
I will just say absolutely. It's a really important piece. And, I spent a lot of time talking with foundation trustees about advocacy and, and again, helping sort of break down that we're not just talking about lobbying. We're not just talking about politics. In many cases, we're talking about the work that they're already supporting. I can also send, when I send out some of the follow-up material, a link to, we've been part of coalition called Stand for Your Mission that's sort of coordinated by BoardSource and working with the United Philanthropy Forum and the National Council of Nonprofits, talking about the importance of advocacy and the important role that board members have. And they have there's a discussion guide that we prepared specifically for foundations. And so I can send that out as well.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else, guys, before we let Abby jump off? You're welcome to hang on too, Abby. I think we're going to do just a little bit of kind of structured debrief here because we just absorbed a ton of information. And I'm sure people's heads are kind of swimming with it all. Anything else? Any last questions for Abby before we pivot to a debrief? Okay.
All right, well, I will jump off, but no, again, please feel free as you're thinking about other things that you wish you had asked or follow-up information, just send it my way.
And I cannot recommend Alliance for Justice enough, you guys. They truly have like a 1-800 number you can call, and it is staffed by attorneys 24/7. So the number of times I've called Abby or other people with like a panic, like, I might have broken the law, but I'm not sure. Can you help me? And most of the time I haven't broken the law. Actually, I think I've never broken the law. Just always had to be
And I'll just say, when you send those emails, don't put in writing, I think I broke the law.
I always call.
Like, just say, call me. I'm always amazed, and Tim can, at people who are like, I did this, I don't think it was legal, but, and I'm like, no, don't say that. So
Call them.
I'll leave you with that message.
They will save you over and over again. Thank you.
Thanks, take care, bye.
And Jessica, I think I'll hop off too unless you want me for your debrief. I don't know that you need me, so.
It's totally up to you, Tim. I think it might be interesting conversation for you to hear kind of what folks on the program side are thinking would be useful and
Okay,
what that's making them realize. But if you have other things to do, I understand that
I'm
too.
happy to stay, yeah.
Don't snitch on yourself. Thanks, guys. I do. Okay. So can you guys see this now? I meant to share this earlier. I just wanted to I think this is especially relevant given what we heard from Abby, that there's this whole set of questions about what's possible and what's legal, and then a whole other set of questions about what's actually comfortable for your foundation. How willing are you to cede control? How willing are you to invest in something that may produce this outcome and it may produce a totally different outcome? How willing are you to have a direct voice that could ruffle some feathers? Like, all of these questions will come into play as we keep on moving through things. So we've already done this first session focused on policy landscape. That was with Katie Ham and Melissa Rooker, who came in and talked about state and federal policy landscape. Our session 2 was today focused on legal constraints. We'll have a session shortly after the new year. We have 2 folks coming in from other foundations, one that's taken a very grassroots, local government based approach to early education advocacy called the Bainham Foundation. And then the second that I am still waiting to have confirmed, but is based in North Carolina, the Weiner Foundation, and they're part of a statewide early education funding collaborative that's really focused on supporting state government advocacy. So 2 kind of different looks at different types of foundations, and then we'll start transitioning into this sort of self-assessment piece. So click through here. We heard from Abby. I just want to reserve space for what facts or observations really stood out to folks. What did this leave you thinking? And I always do this, so you'll have to bear with me, but I think it always produces some helpful thinking. So we're going to take just 2 minutes on our own to really jot down, actually capture, put your thoughts down on paper rather than just diving in. A couple minutes to jot down what facts or observations really stood out from hearing Abby speak.
There's so much. Yeah, I mean, I think where it puts me, which is not, I don't think it was per se new thoughts. I felt like I had a pretty good understanding of kind of what we could and could not do as a private foundation. I think the biggest piece that I wasn't aware of was kind of the general ops piece. And that actually lowering your level of kind of risk legally. So that was very new news for me. But other than that, I felt like I generally had a sense of the rest. Where it puts my head is, again, like, yes, what are some more mechanisms where as foundations we can fund more grassroots organizers, even when we're thinking about early ed. If you're not organizing families, if you're not organizing early ed teachers, right? And those are the voices that legislators are hearing. It's hard to really get the level of mind change and heart change. Data, all that is extremely important. You need to layer that with kind of the stories and the truths of people's lived experiences. And on top of that, organizing those type of groups is very challenging, right? Those are people that have constraints in times, constraints in resources, and oftentimes folks that are organizing those groups have less resources themselves. And so I think that foundations have a real opportunity to provide resources in that direction that can provide stipends, that can provide meals for organizing and all those kind of pieces. But I think figuring out kind of the right mechanisms for that, whether that's an intermediary or something like that, I would be very interested to think through with a group like this. So that's one area that I think is ripe for like innovation, consideration, in kind of building. And then the other piece that, you know, we didn't quite get into obviously in this call because it doesn't have to do with the legality, but really thinking of the power of narrative change. And I think that's a really ripe area that foundations obviously can do a ton of stuff on. How do you build a coalition that's putting out a level of consistent messaging that is really, really building a different narrative in folks' minds? And then how do you get that message to groups that are maybe a little more closer to the ground? Thoughts?
Thank you. Kelly?
I was trying to think back. I think when we were originally going through the proposal, you had this topic like spread over 2 days. And I understand why now, because I think that we probably could talk about this topic for about 2 days and learn on this topic. And so I was struck by kind of the breadth of the opportunity that we all kind of have in this moment, and kind of the complexity of the system, the nuances of, you know, what things are, you know, in the gray area versus outside of the gray area on both sides of that gray area, fueled kind of often by vague language. And so, I mean, all of this, I think, is happening at like a perfect time. I don't know if any of you were on the Partners in Quality call the other day or yesterday morning, but you know, there is some concern on the Missouri side about the Build Back Better plan, and you know, if and when that passes, you know, Missouri potentially not taking the money. You know, there possibly is an opt-out. And one of the things that we heard from our nonprofit partners and from our community members is getting an advocacy and a message out to the community and across the state about why that this is so important that Missouri actually take the dollars. And so it just like this kind of framed that actual real life thing that potentially could happen in our state in a new and different way for me.
I think, and just a message, I was like, you knew this was gonna blow my like hair off. Well, thank goodness I don't have any hair to blow off, but like, as there's always something new to learn. Like y'all, like 3 pages of notes, and I was like, we were out here trying to launch a whole C4 like of things that I'm like, oh, I didn't even know that. We can ask that. That's okay. And I think that she opened with this, but I mean, I'm gonna find ways to use it every day. That advocacy is the most effective strategy in the philanthropic toolbox to fulfill your mission, right? And we have lots of tools in our toolbox, but being able to sit with the reality that this is the most effective tool, and being able to bolster our learning and our comfort even in that is so important as we sit in this space of like post-pandemic. I'm chuckling because my 14-year-old has been calling it the new variant Omarion, and I'm like, Omarion is a 90s R&B singer, sis, not. So if anybody has a Greek alphabet for teenagers learning guide, that'd be good. But we're being asked, right, to sit in a solutions space right now, and our old tools are not going to work the same way. They just will not. They just won't. And so, I think I'm like, when is she coming back? Like, when do we do this again? And when do we start bringing like problems of practice, Like, I love, there's the conversation from the Kaufman folks about the language in their grants, right? Like, there are problems of practice, Kelly was bringing up about who sits in the coalition and what that means. There are all of these, I would love to be able to start bringing those in so that they don't stay barriers, that we can get comfortable with ambiguity here so that we can help others get comfortable with ambiguity elsewhere. So yeah, I don't know, Hallie. My kiddo, like, profession gets the pronunciation wrong half the time. Yeah, but she was emphatic about it being Omarion. So
I like that anyways. I like it better. I'm going with it.
Okay, all right, I'll let her know.
I think this conversation is so empowering, like, because in the framing of, and I think what we heard today as a takeaway for me is, like, we can do a whole lot of stuff regardless of our tax status. All of us can do a whole lot of stuff. In fact, there's very little things we actually can't do. And even if it may seem like we can't do it, there's actually probably a way. It just may be like a little less direct or involving other partners or something, but it's like, not to get fixated on the limitations, the restrictions, rather first decide what you're trying to do, and then get the experts to help you figure out your path forward from there. And I just, I am so thankful for Tim and the team here being such great partners in the work, because I feel like their approach has consistently been, let's talk about this and let's figure out if there's a way. And so, like, having that mindset allows us to explore so many things that, I hope that others in other organizations on the call, like, feel like they can build that with this knowledge that we're building as a cohort, so that they can approach any opportunities kind of in that way. But I just think it's great. One of the things that, this is unrelated to the topic of today, but with Boulder advocacy being here, I thought about it. I think some of the hesitation sometimes, like, if we get beyond, like, if we get some people's boards or decision makers to get beyond the thinking that legally we can't do advocacy or lobbying or other things in that realm, maybe sometimes the hesitancy is, yeah, but what impact, like, what's the impact of that work? How do we know? It's too hard to measure, some of those things. And so now my mind is also starting to go toward I think Boulder advocacy has some ideas there and some resources out there on evaluation. And so if that's some of the things that people experience as they're going back to their boards and talking about what's possible, if they get some of that pushback, maybe Boulder advocacy could be a resource for that conversation as well.
I think that's a great point. I think especially when I know, Miles, one of your ahas was around general operating support grants, and they are fantastic. Like, they're an incredible tool. I also think evaluating them gets a lot harder because you're essentially giving a check and being like, you do you, and let us know what happened at the other end if you want, but you don't have to. Like, a lot of times some foundations don't even want to get a lot of reporting on the end of a general operating grant. So we can definitely talk about that and build that into some of our sort of second half of this cohort work. Others sort of want to debrief what they heard, what they thought? Monica, Constance, Tim, others?
Well, I thought today was really interesting, really personally empowering. I can certainly name a lot of moments previously, like when I was an organizer and like what I had mentioned earlier, maneuvering through C3, C4, PAC, Super PAC, and where this knowledge would have come super in handy. So I really appreciate like the high level access to the knowledge. Yeah, and it's really interesting to see everything laid out. Like, these are different examples of like calls to action, direct versus grassroots. There's so many flavors of like advocacy. I think of like so many ice cream flavors, but there's only like 1 or 2 ice cream flavors that are lobbying, like BAM, like political, super partisan, like BAM. And then I've learned a new word today, like earmarking, earmarking grants. That's another like thing added to my toolbox. I think a reflection I have is that I think a lot of this knowledge is developing in grassroots organizations. I know we've been mentioning it. I've been in many spaces where, you know, community members, they want to rally, they want to like organize an event, and they want to invite like the selected official or person running for office, or they want to go out in the streets and like have an action. And it is a little disheartening to say like, oh, but you know, the organization can't support you in that effort for XYZ reason, or because it's like, you know, I think there's like definitely a bridge of understanding there. But I do feel definitely more empowered, more tools in my toolbox to be able to address that gap.
Yeah, Constance, I use the example a lot of times when I talk about this of an electric fence. You just say, hey, lobbying is that electric fence. Don't touch the fence. And everybody goes, well, what if I touch it here? Well, what if I touch that end of the fence? I'm like, just don't touch the fence. It's just walk around the fence. And if you can do that, all this is very easy. But I think Holly hit the nail on the head that it can be hard, but there's always a way to get to it and to accomplish it. And I think what our approach does, you know, I think in our discussion, I think you can see like we've created the easy approach for us, which is no lobbying. We put that into our grant agreement, and then we have a report. That's the easy approach rather than spending time talking about the nuance. How do we make it happen? The other easy button is the general support grant, and I support that for lots of reasons. I think it's more equitable. I think it eliminates a lot of legal concerns and risk for us. So I prefer that easy button than the one that we take, which is let's just put this language in the agreement that you can't do it. Because I think Holly's right. There's almost always a way around it. Just don't touch the fence.
All right, unless there's anything else, I just wanted to again remind folks our next, this should be on your calendars, January 12th from 9 to noon. We will be virtual again. And then it's also on your calendars. I'm going to try to do a quick head count. Raise your hand if you're planning on coming to Charbar at 3:30 for a very, very optional, very, very in person happy hour. All right, I've got a reservation. I'll make sure it is enough for at least 5 people. Ooh, grant, yes. Tim, I'm thumbs up on that idea. That would make me very excited if Kauffman had a new grant agreement with that language out. Some people just see it and it freaks them out. I mean, I think that like subtle thing that applies to grantees is like lobbying is bad. Like, don't do it. It's bad. Lobbying is bad. Advocacy is bad. Okay. Anything else before we wrap up?
Can I put a plug in for an outdoor space at Charbar if it's available, since it's beautiful?
Great weather for it. Perfect.
Vitamin D. Yes, please.
All right. I'll see some of you later. And if not, have a happy holiday and I'll see you all in the new year.
Thanks, Bye, y'all.